Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Practically Platonic. Hi, Sylvia.
Hey there.
So in this chapter on Providence, Plotinus talks about the nature of the universe and the role of intelligent divinity in it. And I found these two chapters, there's two chapters on Providence, to be rather interesting. And Plotinus makes some very striking statements. And so one of the statements is that injustice is a source of amazement among human beings because they think that the human being is the valuable thing in the universe since nothing is wiser. And he places humanity into a place in nature that doesn't necessarily exclusively favor humans as a sort of chosen people or chosen species. And he also points out that, and I quote, "The universal express principle contains both wicked and good deeds and includes even the former as its parts. The universal express principle does not, of course, generate evils, but accompanies them." So in his perspective, the evils that we face, such as vice and so forth, are not necessarily, or in fact are not, generated by the logos or by the intelligent design running through the cosmos, but rather it's just a necessary part of it. So there's a difference there between it existing by virtue of design versus it existing out of natural necessity. So there's a lot to digest here. And Sylvia, what was your view on these two chapters?
I think that he didn't really answer the mail, but I was also wondering if in these writings, which he did write, I guess they were not just notes from lectures he gave. He did actually put these down, but I had to remind myself that we don't necessarily perhaps have to read this book with the belief that his ideas are complete or that he believes that he has totally understood everything. I feel like this section, there are still areas in which he was struggling to completely have a clear answer, specifically on the question of wickedness, which I'm going to call it wickedness versus evil because we've already defined evil kind of differently. And I find that there are sections where he kind of contradicts himself on this topic of evil and or wickedness in relation to other sections we've already read, and even in relation to other parts of the two chapters, which obviously in the original text says put together by Porphyry or I guess Porphyry did divide these up too, just so that they would be like nicely lined up with the title. So there'd be 9 of them. But we don't actually know in what order Plotinus actually wrote these before they were organized. So I think that there's a lot here that doesn't completely answer questions someone might have. But on the other hand, I do like that it sets up Providence in a manner, much like everything else, that isn't really quite the concept of intelligent design that might exist, at least in modern Christianity. It's a little more nuanced. And again, it's the providence of a superior entity that isn't really sentient in the way that the Abrahamic God appears to be, for example. And there's also an aspect of free, and the way that he explains free will, I guess, also therefore differs. And this aspect of fate, insofar as the actions that we take that are through free will. And also the fact that he points out that, like, when we do good things, for example, it's not that it's Providence acting, but rather that our actions are in line with Providence. I found that struck me. It reminded me kind of like the Tao concept of flow, of like that it's not necessarily something imposing its will on you. There's this on a higher plane or whatever, there's like this harmonious flow of things. And when we tune into it, or when we choose to do things justly, we inadvertently then do things that are harmonious with that flow. So when we do just actions and we align our fate with Providence, it's not that necessarily, it doesn't sound like necessarily Providence is causing things to happen, but simply that we are aligning ourselves with that, which I think goes along with the way that we can choose to orient ourselves toward the good. Like, the good is already everywhere. We just need to align ourselves with it.
Building on what you're saying, I have a quote from the chapter that is related to what you're saying here. Plotinus says, "Human injustices against each other, however, might have as their cause the desire for good, when through their inability to attain it, human beings turn against other human beings. So from that perspective, it is the human desire for the good, and also for example, satisfying the needs of yourself and the people around you. And so that in itself is not vice. That is, in fact, virtue, because you're attempting to help other people, to support other people, to provide for them in this sort of civic virtue sense. But when you're in a situation where you're unable to attain this, then you might turn to injustice. So, for example, warfare and theft and violence and lying and cheating, those sort of things. So
Right.
the circumstances for virtue and vice often are the same. It's just how we respond and react to those circumstances that determine whether we are really going to pursue the good or will fall into evil. And so Plotinus says, evil must be considered to be a lack of goodness, but the lack of goodness must be here because the good is in another. This other matter, then, in which the good is, since it is other than the good, produces the lack. So this goes back to the earlier chapters where the privation of matter, the absence of any sort of fixedness or determined quality to it, is a source of vice, because no matter how much you pursue matter and material things, you can really never be satisfied with it. And the good is turning towards the intelligible realm. And through that, you will become naturally, spontaneously a virtuous person. Whereas when you turn towards privation, matter, then you'll inevitably just turn toward vice, and all sorts of injustices will arise from that. That's my interpretation.
Right. But let us not confuse the term vice with evil, right? Because in his worldview, there isn't really the kind of evil that is seen in the Abrahamic religions. It's because if I recall correctly, even when man falls into vice, it's not like people are ever like, I'm going to be evil. That is never the intent. It's just kind of a misguidedness, because really, he says, all living beings are desiring the good. It's just our inability to truly comprehend what good is sometimes leads us into vice. Therefore, actions that are unharmonious or create suffering for us or others, right? I guess fundamentally, vice, why is it a vice? If now that we've gotten to this point in the book, it's a vice because its actions are choosing actions that will result in a fate that is unharmonious with providence. Does that make sense? But it's never because we are evil incarnate, because his definition of evil, as we've already discussed and you just brought up again, is basically privation. It's not really a very moral evil. I guess my point is just the evil that exists in other worldviews doesn't really even exist in Plotinus's worldview.
Right.
It is simply humans just often cause themselves suffering or things that we deem unjust by a misguided attempt at their desire for good.
Right. So self-destructive tendencies,
right,
are basically a result of vice, and it's an evil state, maybe not morally evil. It's not that anybody is, in Plotinus's worldview, is defying the word or the law of God.
Exactly.
And so when we're in this world, we're in effectively a natural world. I mean, it's not atheistic, and it's not materialistic either.
It's not denying, it's not purposely going against the word of a God, but it is unwittingly being unharmonious with providence, I think, if that makes sense. But it's much more nuanced. It's not quite as black and white. And again, it's evil because there's an aspect of privation, because instead of realizing what the good actually is, they're orienting themselves toward aspects of material, which is privation.
Right. And so,
but even that, he says, is fundamentally necessary. As we get into the chapter, he makes a comment about that he thinks it's unfair or incorrect to judge individual aspects of the image of the universe, of the material universe, because in the intelligible realm, the world soul or the everything is one thing, right? There is no particulars, but when it's reflected here and is an image in the material sense, everything becomes a particular, and you can't have a quality without without something that's different from it or an antithesis. therefore everything gets separated out. But he thinks that we should, at least in making a judgment or having a concept of the nature of good and evil at a cosmic level, we need to not judge particulars, but look at holistically the entire universe, that as a whole it's good. And he makes some sort of comparison with like the body, or like things that might be happening in our body where our cells are like, I don't think he really had any good understanding of it, but like, where our cells might be killing off other cells that have become infected, right? Like your white blood cells. That on its own, if you were those other cells, might seem, unjust or bad.
Well, yeah, he makes that
if
point
you look at it cosmically
about the animal world. Why is it that animals kill other animals? And
right.
he points out that's just a matter of necessity, because
Right. And he says that about humans to some degree too, though. That's where
right.
it gets a little confusing. So like, I guess one thing he says, and I was trying to find, is early in the first section in 3.2, he makes a comment where he says that we're not just where he talks about our free will, and that he says we're not just an extension of the universal soul, in the sense that we're not just automaton of the universe, and we have willpower. But that's confusing to me, because I feel like up to this point he said that that everything is also just an extension of the universal soul. So I'm confused by that.
My interpretation is that humans can incline toward vice or virtue. And so the capacity for vice exists out of necessity, but not design. And human beings are maybe one of the rare forms of life that can actually voluntarily make that decision. So the animals that slaughter other animals to eat, or out of fear and vice, or out of fear and wrath and so forth, they might be urged by instinct, and it might just be inevitable that they behave like that. But humans are unique in being able to carry out injustices against one another. That's kind of runs to the question of like, well, are humans all that much different from animals, and why so? But I think in his period, as the Stoics proposed as well, that there's a spark of the divine in humanity, because we have a faculty of reason and rationality that animals don't apparently have. At least they don't have it to the same extent. One could argue that certain animals like cats and dogs are certainly capable of all sorts of virtues. But as far as the faculty of reason goes, it seems that it's humans who have a monopoly on this in the animal world. So we can voluntarily act within the world in ways that animals cannot.
But this is something that's informed by your other readings, because that's my point. Is if we were to take what he wrote in a vacuum, I feel like there's some inconsistencies, because he states that we are not just an extension of the universal soul without willpower. But then I feel like he doesn't really explain why not, or how not, unless he does somewhere and you can indicate it to me. But I feel like I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I feel like that's you trying to interpret what he's saying and also bringing other text to it. But what is his expectation of a reader if he doesn't explain some of this? He makes a statement which to me appears to contradict everything he said up to this point.
Right. And so at this point, maybe it's just something in the original text, or he hadn't quite fleshed out his ideas sufficiently, as is often the case in this text.
Right. And that is how we should be reading this, right? Because looking at this kind of in a vacuum, well, almost in a vacuum, we're reading this together, and I'm not reading it within the context of academia or anything. I'm just realizing as I read it, I don't think that in his mind, this is fully fleshed out, I would assume. Or it certainly has a lot of error, or it has a lot of strings that don't reattach somewhere. There's a lot of loose ends.
Well, ideally, Plotinus would have been able to read the whole thing from start to finish and edit it from start to finish a few times. But he didn't have the opportunity to do so. Right. So we're left with what's available. So yeah.
Right. And we don't know what maybe he formulated, and maybe just, who knows, we may have lost texts.
Right.
He may have formulated things in some of his lectures which didn't make it to paper.
Right. What's your view?
Go ahead.
What's your view on the reincarnation that's mentioned in this chapter?
I like it. I don't know. My view, I guess, well, I'd have to remember exactly where he brings it up.
So if you're an oppressor, or you've committed great injustice and violence against others, then in the present lifetime, you'll suffer the same fate. And so he says that people who suffer injustices in this life might just be reaping their karma, so to speak, using a Buddhist term. from a past life.
I think it's a way for him to kind of justify the fact that bad things happen, because he hasn't really found he hasn't really justified it much better, other than, like, I think him saying that things are just as they are and that we're the ones assigning good and bad to things is a better argument than trying to use transmigration of the soul as an excuse to explain why there's wickedness. That being said, I don't necessarily disagree with him on the idea of the transmigration of the soul. Also, because if there is one, it pops up in almost every truly ancient belief system, whether or not in modernity, even some of the scions of those belief systems want to admit it. Secondly, if there's the concept that, which he also brings up, he says, the true cosmos is blessed by achieving greatness by not producing and makes its greatest contribution by remaining itself, which is the concept that, no matter or energy is created nor destroyed. I think there's more logic behind the idea that there's a finite amount of energy or material or whatever, souls, that are constantly being reincarnated, versus the idea that there are always new souls coming into being. Because I've always found that kind of a crazy concept, that there's like this, every time someone's born, that's a new soul. When is there like a projected point in which it will end, and that the Providence has like a capacity they already know of? Is it infinite? What's the deal?
Well, yeah, in the Christian perspective, there is like a finite amount of time. Well, in the Christian sense, there's a finite amount of time, and eventually there is the end times, and all the souls are judged. So there's a certain number of souls that will be produced at conception, and then they will be judged, and then time comes to an end.
Well, that's one interpretation. I mean, if you read the text of the Bible, I don't know if it's quite that clear. There's also apocryphal texts that indicate otherwise, that also indicate, there's some apocryphal texts that insinuate that Jesus actually did believe in the transmigration of the souls. Of course, those ones are the texts that were outlawed, burned. Now we only have reference in other later texts. And this certainly. Like, my point is, like, whatever the true belief of these ancient humans was, even within the Christian belief system, we only have what we have now, which I guess what I'm saying is, what we have now does not necessarily reflect what was believed in antiquity by even that part of the world or those worldviews. And just modern Christianity has a belief system that, and even there's like so many different.
Right. I suppose with the idea of reincarnation, one idea that stems from that, which is also the case in Buddhism most prominently, is that if injustices that you suffer in the present lifetime are a result of you having carried out the same actions in past lives, then it makes sense to behave yourself in the present lifetime to have sort of sympathy for your future selves in the future.
I could also, yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And so by virtue of this reality of reincarnation, or metempsychosis, to use the Greek term, that you should live your best life, your most virtuous life, and to avoid unnecessarily harming other people, as a sort of sympathy toward all of your future lives. So in the earlier tradition of Buddhism, you are subject to rebirth, and you have been subject to rebirth since the immeasurable beginning, because there's no beginning to time in Buddhism, and you will be reborn immeasurable times into the future until you achieve nirvana, in which case this whole transmigration comes to an end, and you're an arhat, and that can be a male or a female. And then in Mahayana Buddhism, the ideal is not that you step out of transmigration, but you actively become a part of it, but with wisdom. So you basically vow that you're going to help all sentient beings to alleviate their suffering and guide them towards wisdom and liberation. And so from that perspective, though, you're actively reincarnating, but you're quite happy to do it because you're going to help other beings. But because you have wisdom,
you're going to be a mortal being, or are you some sort of like spiritual being?
Well, at the beginning stages, there's 10 stages. At the beginning stages, you're just a normal human being with the aspirations. And then once you go up the stages, then you get sort of supernatural powers. And then you basically become, I guess, sort of transcendental. And you effectively become what we would call a god, although the Buddhists don't say that. They don't say that you're a god, because gods are subject to rebirth and reincarnation, which is a whole other difference in cosmology between Platonism and Buddhism. And then you also have, The Druids apparently believed in reincarnation, according to the writings of Julius Caesar and others. And you also have, of course, ideas of reincarnation also in the Hindu traditions as well.
And the Hellenic and the Roman traditions.
Yeah, so Plato is one of the early witnesses to the belief in reincarnation, metempsychosis. So it's a common enough belief in the ancient world.
Right.
And I think nowadays too. I mean, a lot of people are amicable to the idea, even if they haven't really quite thought through why it would happen or the implications of it. But a lot of people are amicable to the idea.
Right. So you mentioned that in Buddhism, there was no beginning to the universe. In this chapter, he kind of says the same thing. He says that the Neoplatonists don't believe that the universe has always existed as an image of the intellect, because the intellect's always existed, and therefore he says the universe has always existed. So there's never been a creation of the universe, which then makes me think, okay, what does that mean? Like individual star clusters and galaxies have been born.
Well, I was puzzled by that too, because I thought back to Timaeus, where there is a demiurge who actually sets the luminaries, the heavenly bodies in motion, which is when time begins.
Well, he doesn't necessarily follow everything that is laid out.
Yes. So my sense is that what he's arguing is that the intelligible realm is eternal, and that there's no beginning to it, no end to it, and that so you can still have a beginning to our present world in the material sense, but it's
to our world, like
to our material world,
Earth,
but not the world.
That's not what he says.
Not the world soul,
the universe. That's not what he said, though. That's
right.
He said
I know. So there's a difference there between the Timaeus and here. So
right, which is fine, but I don't care. So, like, even in the Timaeus, I don't feel that. I don't know what Plotinus thought, but me reading Plato says, this is just a hypothesis. This is just like, he literally says, we have no idea. This is just like me entertaining the most feasible story I'm going to tell you. Here's a story. Mm-hmm. So I don't think he's setting it as canon that people must adhere to very strictly when it comes to the details. It's more the larger implications of how things work. But my question to this is, if he thinks that the universe has always existed, does he think that planet Earth, as we think of it now, and man himself has always existed? Or if not, I wonder if his cosmology would include something like the concept of cyclical universe, the cyclical nature of the universe, which we see in other belief systems, but that has also been entertained as the Big Bang, Big Crunch in physics.
I think it's inevitable that you'll probably believe in like a cyclical understanding of history if you see time as infinite. In which case you'll just see, I mean, he could just look back to his own time and be like, well, some countries rise and fall. And I mean, he doesn't talk about this, but I mean, there's speculation. Well, has humanity therefore always existed? I mean, he didn't have enough data to make that sort of discussion or that sort of argument. So we can only speculate.
Right. It's not that I'm saying that's the case. I'm just saying the statements he makes leave room for the reader to contemplate different aspects that would leave room for in your own personal understanding of what you think might or might not be the case, things that can be entertained or not, and how certain things that he puts forth may be or may not be syncretic with other worldviews or other bits of like basically other theories or hypotheses we have now based on empiricism, because even the age of the world or of the universe, these are at best theories, hypotheses. They don't actually know. Right.
I mean, our present cosmology. I mean, when you do read about some of the theories that are coming out of like modern physics and so forth, multi-dimensions and so forth, and on math, it apparently makes sense, but nobody's actually observed these other dimensions. So it becomes almost.
There's something going on all the time. Just this morning, I saw an article on, I think it was Nature, about like that possibly they figured out a way mathematically that you could go beyond the speed of light without breaking the laws of physics, which is something which I don't know, maybe it's nonsense, but they don't really know. There's constantly conjectures and things being tested out. It's just using a different methodology than rationalism.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in 2,000 years, who knows how people will look back at our present cosmology and physics, and they might be reading these sort of things the way we read Plotinus and the Stoics and so forth. So
Right. So I have more questions.
sure.
In section 3.211, he says, or like my understanding of that chapter, of that paragraph, is that the express principle of the express principle of providence allows and wills evil. That to me seemed contradictory with what we've already discussed being the understanding. So let me look here. He says, are individual things the way they are because of physical necessities and consequences, and are they as well as they can be? In fact, they are not. Rather, an express principle produces everything like this by ruling it and wants it to be so, and itself produces in accordance with reason what we call evils. So am I misunderstanding? Is the express principle he's talking about here not
Logos.
the express principle, not logos?
It's logos. That's the translation. Logos.
Okay. Well, then he's contradicting himself, because let's replace the word express principle with logos. In fact, they are not. Rather, logos produces everything like this by ruling it and wants it to be so, and itself produces in accordance with reason what we call evils. So now he's saying that evil is willed by the logos.
Willed as in it is out of necessity that it arises. It's not.
That's not what he says. He says it's directly willed by the logos, and it does, because it does not want everything to be good. That's the next part of the sentence. Just as a craftsman does not fashion every part of the living being as eyes. So he's not, my understanding is if he's making the comparison with a craftsman, he's here saying that it's actually providence's will for there to be evil, versus what he says later, which we've already discussed, which is that evil or wickedness is just actually comes out of necessity of the material world by actions we choose versus being in harmony with providence. So this is one of the major contradictions he has in his chapters, which he makes a couple of different times and slightly different, phrased in slightly different manners. So this is like a problematic section. Maybe in the future we'll better understand this section, or if anybody else wants to comment and explain it if I'm misunderstanding. But if you go read it, I don't think it really lets itself be interpreted as what you're saying. It's pretty clear that he's saying it directly wills it, like a craftsman wills things to not be perfect.
Well, and you're right. And elsewhere, he does say the universal express principle does not, of course, generate evils, but accompanies them. So
right, which is the opposite of what he says here.
To will versus to accompany.
Right. To accompany something, I understand that, because he also says like it's linked sometimes, which makes sense. Like I can be surrounded by crappy people, and so my fate is linked up with them, or I interact with them. Doesn't mean I will them or I'm having them behave that way.
But it's not stopping it. I mean,
no, it's not stopping it. But here he's specifically saying that it's fashioning these things. He's willing it. It's a much more active. It seems like it. He says it's the thing that is creating it, basically.
Well, this goes. I think it goes back to the discussion of matter.
It self-produces, and he produces it. That the logos produces it. Like, okay, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
But that's the logos, though, is not. It's not the same as the intelligible realm consciously thinking that there ought to be evil in this world, but rather the express principle, the logos, is the it's a principle. It's just a how do you say, a sort of pattern that initiates as it comes into the material world. So I don't know if there's as strong a contradiction there, but it's something to think about for sure.
Well, what is the definition of logos? I mean, I guess you tried to give it to me right now, but I don't get it.
So let's go to the.
Or rather, even so like, you say that he means logos when he says express principle, but in every other instance in these chapters, he is referring to providence as being the express principle with its activities in this world. So, and the book itself defines providence, which we don't have to agree with this guy's specific definition. I'm not sure where exactly he gets it, but providence is also foresight, which makes sense. It's because, the intelligible realm, the logos, the one knows everything because there is no time.
So in the glossary at the back of the book, it says, as a technical term, the product of a higher principle at a lower level,
logos.
logos. And in non-technical context, logos is used for items within the full range of elements of rational communication. The technical sense provides the ontological foundation for non-technical senses.
And the definition that it gives for providence is, it says that it can either mean foresight, or more specifically, the direction given of the lower sensible world by the higher intelligible world. So it's kind of like not exactly intelligent design, but the thing that is guiding the lower sensible world,
Mm-hmm.
based on what the intent of the higher intelligible world is. I think that when he says express principle in this section, he's talking about providence, not logos. But I think we disagree on what is intended here. And I still think that there is a contradiction. Going back to what we were talking about earlier about lives, in section 3.2.13, he talks about demons or daemons and their lives. So I was just wondering, I wonder if he thinks, are they mortal in a sense? Do they die and do they return? Do they reincarnate, or only humans inflicted with death? And then I thought, is it kind of like the Islamic jinn, who there's good jinns and bad jinns, and jinns have families, and at least in some of their stories, how does that work?
Well, I'm not sure if Plotinus discusses them, but Iamblichus, his successor, definitely does. And I mean, the daimons go back to the discussion of Socrates and Diotima, and Diotima says that the daimons are the intermediaries between gods and humanity, because the gods don't actually directly involve themselves or interact with human beings, but rather it's these intermediary beings. So whether they're inflicted with death or not, well, they're not embodied material beings, although they clearly interact with the material world in varying ways. So that's an open question. I can't really say whether they're mortal or not. But at the same time, too, I mean, we have immortal souls, but we're embodied in matter, which is impermanent and fallible, and inevitably we are destined to die. So
right, but even the nature of our souls is not necessarily tied to the ego, the identity that we embody when we're here. Whereas daemons, being spiritual beings, they have do they have an identity in the way we think of identity?
It's a good question. So
I'm not expecting an answer. I'm just
using the cosmology that I understand it from Iamblichus. I do believe that the daimons are basically under the direct command of higher intelligences, and they don't have free will. And kind of deviating from our philosophical discussion, in the later magical tradition, it was believed that you can command a daimon to do something by using the name of their boss. So all of the daimons are under the command of certain archons, which are the planetary deities, and then you find the proper one, and then you basically use in the name of this god or goddess that you will do this, and then so you can command them because they don't have free will.
Right, and this dynamic exists in the Islamic Christian belief system. I mean, they have jinns, but also the angels being without free will and directly controlled by God. So I guess if we take Iamblichus's structure as a given, I guess I can answer my own question, and I don't think there would be reincarnation, because it doesn't. Some of the results of reincarnation, such as a sort of karma, that he doesn't call it karma, but wouldn't be necessary because there's no free will, and they're also not in material bodies, so they're not dying.
I suppose you could almost see them as coming down on missions from a higher reality, and then
but they seem more like AI than they're pre-programmed. If they don't have free will, they don't truly have a unique identity. They're not embodied in any sort of way. There's no purpose for them. There's no bettering of themselves that they're doing, because they have no free will.
Well, I mean, from our perspective in the material world and the metaphysical world as well, I should say, in the realm of spirit and so forth, we make differentiations between our souls and daimons and so forth, but then at the intelligible realm, it's all one. So at a higher level, it's sort of a mute question of whether daimons are reincarnating or not, because at a higher level too, we don't reincarnate either, because time as we experience it is a result of living in this material world and having embodied souls. But at a higher level, there's just oneness.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm saying when we're humans, when our soul is embodied, we have free will, and we can choose to do good things and bad things. And if we take as a given that we reincarnate, it seems to have since by necessity we seem to constantly be trapped in this body, we have to eventually enlighten ourselves, for lack of a better term, to be able to free ourselves from that. But the daemons are not, their reality is different insofar as that they're daemons. They are not embodied, and they also don't have free will.
Taking a page from the magical tradition, basically for the daimons, our material reality as we experience it is very alien to them. They can't really perceive it, but then in some instances they do get the chance to embody a person,
right? We've discussed this. It's like
through basically possession.
Yeah.
But for humans as well, if you can imagine,
but that is one guy's idea. I don't know, but okay, well, that's a different person's idea. I don't know if that's still in line with Plato or Plotinus's conception.
It is because it's basically the cosmology.
Well, then they have free will to some degree. If they can choose to be naughty and go possess people, unless it's something that they're being told to do by the gods.
So this leads to a cosmological problem, which according to Plotinus, there is a perfect ordering and there is no deviation from it at a certain level. It's only in the material world that you start having, deviation and vice. But you can also introduce a certain amount of chaos there, and you have ideas of like basically rogue agents, rogue daimons, fallen angels, wicked spirits, and so forth, and also basically forces, divine forces that are basically rebelling against the gods so for Plotinus, he doesn't talk about like wicked spirits and so forth, but his contemporaries were certainly aware of this. Like in the Greco-Egyptian magical tradition, they definitely understand what wild spirits are and how they're different from like the direct servants of the gods and so forth.
So I guess they are rebel. Somehow they've been able to. But now we're going into a completely different.
But my point is that Plotinus's cosmology doesn't permit that sort of deviation.
Right. Exactly. That's what I'm saying.
Whereas
what you're describing is not permitted here.
Whereas the Iamblichus, his successor, his cosmology does permit deviation, even at a divine level. So it leads to these interesting questions. But just sticking to Plotinus, right? The humans are subject to reincarnation. I'm not sure how it works in his mind for the daimons, but ideally we should be working towards this sort of, transcending this process of transmigration, metempsychosis.
Right. So there's one. Well, I have so many questions, but something he says in section 3.2.17, which seems very melodramatic to me, but I don't even understand what he's talking about. He says in the middle of the paragraph, but those that love also destroy what they love when they are perishable. So I guess I have to back up and read the previous sentence. Indeed, since its nature, what is it? I guess we have to go further up. I guess I have to know what the heck he's talking about. He just goes on and on and on and doesn't like to restate what the subject of his topics are, which is kind of annoying. In 3.2.17, indeed, since its nature corresponds to its creative activity in every respect, the greater its internal differences, I guess it's talking about the universe or the universal soul, or the universe, I guess, the greater its internal differences, the more will it make its products as contraries. And the visible universe is less united than its express principle, so that it is both more of a many and there is greater contrariety, and each thing has a greater desire to live and a greater love of unification. I don't know why they have a greater desire to live or greater desire for unification based on what he said above, but that's not even my question. But those that love also destroy what they love when they are perishable, as they hasten toward their good and the desire of the part for the whole. So I guess he's saying mortal things that are capable of love, destroy what they love. What is that about? Is that just him making an observation on human behavior, or is it actually some sort of rational? Oh, okay, well, I think it's nonsense. I mean, yeah, that happens, but it
seems to just be a passing observation.
Yeah, it's sometimes hard to, or I guess we have to remember sometimes that not everything is said with the same level of seriousness or not all statements are made through the same type of deduction, and things like that sometimes throw me off. I'm like, what is he talking about? He hasn't made a good argument for this. Whereas most of the time, he's like making some sort of argument for things, and then sometimes he'll just say stuff like, I guess, like, I don't know, chocolate ice cream is inferior to vanilla. I mean, if I saw that comment in here, I would not be surprised, I guess, at this point. But that's kind of, I don't know. Okay.
Could be just a passing observation, or it made sense when he was, speaking or writing it at the time.
Right. Also in 3.3.2, he tries to make a comparison between that the universe is like a unified army as a metaphor to why, but that metaphor makes no sense, because a unified army, it's fighting something external, whereas there's nothing external to the universe. If anything, we're fighting each other internally. It would almost be more like a civil war than a unified army.
I mean, if the point he's making is just that the logistics, there's from the top down, there's a logistical structure in order for the army to keep moving forward and for everybody to be functioning within that.
I guess. I don't think it's a good metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I've nitpicked this chapter to bits, but I guess, what else would you like to talk about? So I think we've discussed, so the next chapter also just continues this, right? It's not like a clear division between the first chapter and the second chapter. He just goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what the army thing is. I guess the main things to take from this chapter are his definition of what providence is, how it interacts with the material universe,
or how the material universe is expressed from it.
Yeah, that's a better way of saying that. The difference between events that occur because of providence, if they occur because of providence at all, that's unclear to me, because it seems more like providence is doing its thing, and then the material world, those are just that part is the part that's confusing, where I guess it's more that almost as if providence isn't really in this material world, but almost like over it, and we can choose, or events can choose to occur in a manner, or either actions that humans choose to take, or actions that happen out of necessity in the natural world can either be more or less like the actions of providence. Seems to be kind of what it is. So we can be more or less harmonious with events. And it seems to me that providence is almost, in the intelligible realm, the equivalent of what fate is in the material realm.
Well, we should keep in mind that the material realm is an inferior image of of something higher.
I guess my point is that I don't think he's actually saying that providence directly meddles in the material world. It just exists, and we can choose to take actions that are more in line with providence. And perhaps it somehow influences, but it doesn't directly cause the events that are in this.
Well, as he points out, we can also look at events in the world as if they're on a theater.
Yeah, that whole part.
It's no longer a matter of us being so personally invested and emotionally invested in what we're experiencing, but also more toward seeing things from a detached point of view, seeing it as if you're watching actors on a stage, which will make life presumably a lot easier to handle, especially when you face all sorts of adversities and injustices.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how realistic some of these philosophical ways of trying to perceive things really are in day-to-day life. I don't know that humans can, maybe some humans, if they dedicate their entire life to philosophy, can do it. I don't think most people can actually live like that. But I do like that section where he basically explains that things aren't quite as evil or serious as we make them out to be. When a terrible thing happens to an individual, for example, if it is a play, it's like the actor behind the mask. It's almost like our life, our identity, our ego, like me as Sylvia, the horrible things that happen or don't happen to me in this life. Sylvia is just a mask that the soul is wearing in the play of reality as we perceive it. And in the next line, he says that when the actor goes off stage, as they did at the time, and the same actor would sometimes play different parts and put on a different mask to play a different character. When he comes back on stage, which we can take as a metaphor for reincarnation, he then lives a different life. But fundamentally, none of these things are actually positively or negatively influencing. We're not the soul that is wearing the mask. When the actor dies on stage, I mean, not the actor, but when the character dies on stage, the actor doesn't really die.
Right. Although, of course, that's easier said than done when you're facing
Right.
the
Right.
reality
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
mortality and people that you care about fall sick or some great injustice happens to
Right.
them.
Because we are only really, most of us are only capable of perceiving the masks and not what's behind it.
I think even if you can, my own personal experience of being around people who are very much deeply devoted to religious traditions and philosophical traditions is that humans do have hard wiring, and I don't think it
Yeah.
is possible. And you also have like the whole question of nurture and nature. So you have a genetic reality which is determining a lot of your decision-making processes. And then you also have nurture, which is your conditioning, especially in your childhood, on how you will react to things and conceive of things as well. And so my experience is that you can be very much devoted to a religious idea or a philosophy and have a very well fleshed out perception of morality and so forth and metaphysics and so forth. But then if somebody steps on your toe, you still get angry. And
Right. Well, there's also the difference between people who know a lot of stuff and actually practice.
right.
But like, because what you're talking about is people who know a lot about certain.
No,
I guess-
I'm talking about people who actually do strive towards some sort of higher moral
Okay.
good. But at the same time, too, you have like if you look at their long-term planning and decisions, they still express the same human tendencies as everybody else:
Yeah, that's
self-preservation,
right. Yes.
self-interest. So, for example, like there's the ideal of being a Buddhist monk where you just live with a begging bowl and so forth. But that's when you look at how most monks behave, they're interested in acquiring their own temple and devotees and financial
I think
resources.
very, very few people in the history of mankind have been true unhypocritical sages. Only few people have been true philosophers.
And so my point to that, though, is not that to point out the hypocrisy of most people, but just to point out that we can have these ideals, moral ideals, and think of things in these, higher metaphysical terms. But at the end of the day, there's also still this other reality which always crops up, which is human nature, genetic and natural realities, and maybe unconscious influences on our decision-making processes. So even if you do have these higher ideals, you still inevitably work in a way that's predictable.
Yeah, but you're still the problem isn't that you do that. You can, if people admitted that I am trying the best I can to strive for these ideals, I know that I am falling short of it, and that's just how it is. I'm probably never going to, because there are too many impediments of fear and desires, and that's like that level of honesty I would respect more than the hypocrisy of ignoring or pretending,
Right.
denying that. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm not so much judging that people fall short of it. I'm more judging the hypocrisy of pretending that you are doing that, or truly striving, and they're not ignorant of the fact, I don't think, that they're doing these other things. They're just being hypocritical. But I do think that there has been a handful of, maybe more than a handful of people in the history of humanity that have been true. And that is why philosophers such as Plato and Plotinus and Socrates refer to these men as almost next to gods. Mm-hmm. Because to be truly have a philosopher that truly lives their life to that degree is extremely rare. There are alleged instances, right? Even in other religious traditions, but those people have passed away. We don't know. We don't know what they really were like. We can only know from what has been written about them.
Well, and it's also to have that sort of ideal, even if you never achieve it, at least will guide you towards a better life.
Yes, but I think it's better though when you're honest with yourself.
Right. I mean, that's the step. One of the foundations of humility is recognizing all of your faults and your fallibility. Right.
I don't even remember how we brought this up now.
Well, that might be a good place to end our discussion.
Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.